Hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where today I'm kind of going to be reacting to something that's gone viral in the world of music. And this is something that sort of began on a show called The Candace Owens Show. For those in the music industry or music lovers, you might not be familiar with her, but if you read about politics or pop culture, you probably will be familiar with her. She's probably best known as a right wing commentator and journalist who also focuses a lot on pop culture. So she'll shift back and forth between the two subjects on various episodes. So she's quite versatile, and I think versatility is a good thing. Now, she's talked about music lately as a kind of foray into both pop culture and her political points of view in journalism. And one of the theories that she most recently advanced is that the CIA is behind the rise, promotion, and I think it's fair to say that she even believes that the CIA is responsible for the origins of what's commonly known as gangster rap. And I, in this stream, sort of want to go into where she's wrong and where she's right. Because she's neither fully right nor fully wrong about this. So I want to sort of break it apart one thing at a time, and we'll talk about some really good music at the same time, because that's what this channel is all about. Now, the short answer as to did the CIA invent gangster rap? The answer is no. The government and its various apparati have never invented any form of music. They're not creative enough to do it. And for anyone wondering my views on the CIA itself, I don't think there needs to be a CIA at all. I think that it is dangerous, a waste of time, and a waste of money. And if you want to know more about my views on that, you can really watch a 1988 interview that Dr. Ron Paul did with William F. Buckley Jr. And Ron Paul in that interview really lays out the case for not only the abolition of the CIA, but many similar federal agencies who have no real probative value, are very costly, very problematic, and whatever virtues might have been in the essence of those organizations, if there were any, could be handled by other pre-existing, more locally accountable and more disciplined or institutions with a narrower scope of operations. So you can watch that interview if you want to know my views on that organization. I don't know what Candace Owens's views are on the CIA. She's probably not a fan, but maybe she doesn't even go as far as Dr. Paul in arguing for a very rational case for the organization simply not needing to exist. So now that we've got that out of the way, let's talk about the origins of hip hop. Like any musical genre, there's no particular moment in time or individual that invented a genre, because music is necessarily an unconscious communication across the timeline of history between artists who take inspiration from one another and from their surroundings. And hip hop, if I were to really name one person who I think was so influential in its foundations, I would say that this was probably Gil Scott-Heron. He was a poet, a lyricist, a vocalist, a musician, one of the most interesting men to ever appear before a microphone. And I've talked before on this channel that his collaborations with jazz and soul pianist and composer Brian Jackson were some of the best records ever recorded from the 70s, mid 70s until the end of the decade, thereabouts, early 80s. He worked almost exclusively with Brian, making some of the absolute quintessential records, both musically, lyrically, and thematically. Now, hip hop in general originated among poor Black young men in the East Coast, particularly in parts of New York. And the reason that hip hop was distinct from previous art forms that incorporated spoken word, or from jazz, soul, and funk that often dealt with many of the socially conscious conscious themes of hip hop was that these kids were unique in that their families couldn't afford musical instruments, and many programs in the schools at this time were deprioritizing music either because of budget cuts or for other reasons. So they didn't have access to guitars, pianos, drums, other traditional instruments that, let's say, Brian Jackson was. What they did have access to were records and tapes. They had access to recordings, and hip hop began by spoken word poetry wrapped in rhythm over pre existing music, which we later called samples. So the music is the sample, and the bars are the lyrics. They're what is spoken over the music. Some of it is written down ahead of time, and some is spontaneously improvised. This is known as freestyling. So that was the origin of hip hop. It happened in the late 70s with origins in the early and mid 70s, primarily in the East Coast of the US and primarily in New York. The first rap single to really gain major prominence, comparatively, of course, was Rapper's Delight. It's got the genre in the name of the song, and that was released by the Sugar Hill Gang at the very end of the 70s. And hip hop from there continued to become more and more sophisticated, and there were more and more conscious voices that were becoming prominent in hip hop. Albeit, when I say prominent, I mean prominent in a genre that was still very much under the ground. Schoolie D, for instance, was one of the first people to talk a lot about these conscious issues. And at the same time, there was a segment of hip hop that was really party raps, party music, music to make you feel good, and humor, innuendo, very complicated and sophisticated wordplay was very much a part of this. Now, most of this was happening on the East Coast, but by the mid 80s, and even in the early 80s, frankly, there was a hip hop scene developing in the West Coast. I did a video on this channel about the Egyptian Lover, one of the first leading lights of the West Coast hip hop scene, and it was around his artistic orbit that Ice-T started performing first as a dancer and later as an MC, as a rapper. And that's why the first really well-known West Coast hip-hop artist was Ice-T. Now, Ice-T is someone I call the greatest storyteller in hip-hop, and a lot of that involved stories to do with reality. It wasn't all about parties, it wasn't all about humor, although there was that in it, but it was about the reality of life as a hustler, which is what Ice-T was. He was also a military veteran, and so there were many different experiences he had in a very young life that fed his storytelling. And it was around this time that the term reality rap began to signify something different than sort of the more commercialized feel good rap of people like Run DMC, who by the 1980s were already in the mainstream. And the group of artists most well known in this genre were NWA, who, along with Ice-T, really put that early West Coast hip hop sound on the national, meaning the US, and the global map. Now, NWA's main MC, if you will, and lyricist was Ice Cube, who was always a very conscious person. His lyrics dealt with socioeconomic issues, issues to do with the Black community, not only in South Central LA, Compton, and Watts, but things that were in many respects universal. And NWA were not put together by a record label, and they were certainly not put together by the CIA. They were, however, exploited by a manager that, by all accounts, according to the musicians themselves, and you should always trust the musicians when they're going up against the non-musical elements in the music industry. They had a manager who later co-founded Ruthless Records with NWA's Eazy-E, and this guy was called Jerry Heller. And he screwed them financially. And he got very upset about it. He was someone who patronized, I would say used Eazy-E. Ice Cube, being the conscious person that he was, noticed that straight away. And there were a lot of conflicts. The conflicts between rich or poor, the conflicts between Hollywood and South Central, the conflicts between Black Americans and other ethnic groups. A lot of that we can't talk about on YouTube, but you can listen to No Vaseline. You can listen, which Cube made after he left. in 1991 on his wonderful album Death Certificate, one of the best hip hop albums ever. So there was multiple layers of conflict, and this has been something that has been implicit in the world of hip hop since it became a mainstream format. Because, of course, when music is truly underground, when it's organic, when it's the music of the streets, the people in power don't care. When it becomes the music of the balance sheets, because it's making money, then all powerful people, including politicians, do begin to care. And so we have powerful people by the late 80s and early 90s becoming involved in hip hop, both exploiting it and trying to censor it. And many of these people are from the same backgrounds, with the same 401ks, the same stock for portfolios, with voting rights on the same companies, who are friends with the same politicians, who donate to the same politicians. And so, on the one hand, you had these record labels realize that hip hop was less expensive to produce than rock and roll because it took comparatively less studio time, because there were fewer instruments that needed to be recorded, and rap style vocals and samples are easier and cheaper to record than a band with instruments, whether rock, funk, jazz, soul, etc. So they were looking at it not from the creative point of view, but they were looking at it from that point of view. Because it was radical, because it was fresh, because it was youthful at a time when the pop charts were dominated by AOR bands, many of which had been around for a lot longer than the young kids out of Compton, for instance, who formed NWA. The record labels, which are glorified propaganda and distribution machines now that we don't need physical distribution, they're all PR or propaganda. Choose the adjective of your choice. I'll leave that up to you. But they exploited these bands by pushing out the music that was less costly for them to make, while cheating the artists, not only financially, but many times over the ownership of their own compositions and of their own master rights. At the same time, you had people with deep connections to government trying to censor hip hop. Tipper Gore, married to Senator Albert Gore, who later became vice president and later became the hunter of Man Bear Pig on South Park. That same man. She, in the early 80s, when hip hop was only on the periphery of the censorship radar, although it was, to be fair, there. She helped to organize a group of censorious board DC housewives, as Frank Zappa referred to them, called the Parent Music Resource Council, the PMRC. And they wanted to censor all genres of music except for country and western. Zappa was very clever about pointing that out, but every other genre was game. And by the time hip hop became big, the PMRC went after hip hop artists. Ice-T was a particular target. Charlton Heston, who, by the way, is one of my favorite actors. I agree with his views on the right to self-defense, but I totally disagree with what he did to Ice-T. He did to Ice-T what he wouldn't have dared done to his own industry, the film industry, which is far more violent in terms of its imagery than the music industry, and I don't want to censor that either. But he censored or tried to get, as a shareholder, he tried to get Warner Brothers Records to censor Ice-T's album, the first Body Count album with his heavy metal band, a sort of a fusion of hip hop and heavy metal. And he tried to get it censored because of a song about police. I don't know if we can say the title on YouTube. You can guess why. There's a lot of things that we can't talk about on YouTube, but I think that most of the people who are going to eventually see this will be clever enough to read between the lines. It was a song about police. It wasn't a song praising police. But what it wasn't was a sort of incitement to violence. It was an artistic expression, no different than when police are being portrayed in a violent manner in a Steve McQueen film or an Arnold Schwarzenegger film or a Charlton Heston film or any other film. But they went after Ice-T, probably on a racial basis, because of antipathy towards the music industry, and to try to resurrect the nascent PMRC campaign. Ice-T ended up voluntarily removing the song from the album. First pressings can still be found, and he went to a different record label for the next Body Count album. Zappa, who was still alive at the time, said that Ice-T should have fought it harder, but Ice-T is a man who he moves on from things, and he's put out a lot of great stuff since. In fact, Body Count just this week have come out with a reimagining of Pink Floyd's Comfortably Numb, which I find very, very good. So anyway, back to gangster rap. Gangster rap was something that evolved from reality rap, because while reality rap was a kind of a genre of conscious rap that told the stories of what was happening in these ghettos, in these inner cities, it evolved into something called gangster rap. And gangster rap was something that the record labels, it was a label that the labels gave the music. And while a lot of it was still about the conscious storytelling about the reality that these men faced, that people in other parts of the US and the wider world didn't know about, there was another side to it that glamorized some of these behaviors that destroyed a lot of communities and put a lot of otherwise decent young people in prison. Now, the record labels always push sex and violence when they can because of two things. They want to dumb down the common person to keep them addicted to simplistic music. And they certainly wouldn't want, and this is the even more important thing, they certainly wouldn't want conscious music that explains who runs the record labels and why, their ties to big government, their ties to police, their ties to other corporations, their ties to privately owned prisons, something that Ice Cube has been talking about for a long time and just talked about again. So there is definitely government involvement in the promotion of certain kinds of music that might not be particularly conscious, and their suppression of music that is. Because once you get to high levels of finance, and high levels of public companies and high levels of government, there's not so much a kind of wild conspiracy, which is kind of, at least in terms of a tone, what I think Candace Owens is alleging. But you have similar people doing similar things because similar people in similar positions have the same basic motivations. This isn't a complex conspiracy theory. This is something as simple as human nature. And this is why I think it was very important that even though a lot of the music he was putting out was classed as gangster rap, it was important that Suge Knight started his own label and had a distribution deal that involved no control, no censorship, no guidance over what kind of music Suge Knight was putting out, along with Dr. Dre in the early days of Death Row Records. Now, that was something that Suge himself spoke about at a conference, I believe in either the late 90s or early 2000s at the Four Seasons Hotel in Beverly Hills, that was all about ending the East Coast, West Coast divide. He, in his speech, talked about the fact that his label is not owned and is not controlled. And that's one of the reasons that while his behavior, and I'm not saying he behaved well, he did bad things, but why his bad behavior was amplified by the corporate media, while the bad behavior of, let's say, Diddy, we didn't know about until now, allegedly, is because some people played ball with the machine, with the Matrix, and some people did not. Suge Knight didn't. Suge Knight played his own game, and he didn't play a game with him. And at this conference that involved ministers of religion and civil rights leaders and musicians, he made it very clear. Not saying that he always treated his artists well. He treated some well. He treated others quite the opposite. But there's something to be said about sovereignty in music. So it's definitely true that the powerful in the private sector will exploit musicians, they'll suppress conscious music, and they'll put out music that can be used to sell alcohol, that will be used to sell weapons, used to feed the street to prison pipeline system. They'll do all this and they'll profit from it. And then they'll donate to politicians who try to make a name for themselves, censoring the music. And then the record labels say, well, we'll censor a bit of this, but I want a tax break here. I want a blank tape tax here, as I talked about in the video about the origins of the PMRC and how this censorship came because the record labels and the politicians were in a game of tug of war over a blank tape tax that the record labels wanted so that they can make it less easy for some of the poor kids who invented hip hop to share music with one another. So we're seeing various themes here. Now, obviously, the CIA's main job is to overthrow foreign regimes. That's not what they call it, but it is what we know. And they've done a lot of very bad things domestically, too. We know from one of the greatest journalists of all time, Gary Webb, that the CIA was directly responsible for funneling in and profiting from the trade of crack cocaine. And where was it funneled in? It was funneled into Black communities that were already experiencing job losses because of the inflation of the late 70s and early 80s. And the crack epidemic was a crime against humanity. That was the CIA. The music, though, was not. I've explained the origins of the music. The origins of hip hop are conscious. They're organic. And any genre that becomes popular, again, when the streets translate to the balance sheets, everyone from the politicians to the record labels, who are really all the same group of people, they will begin to exploit. And that's just that is exactly what happened. Now, why would the CIA want to influence culture? The answer is that they would, and that the answer is that they do. They've done it with drugs. They did it with crack in the 1980s, as Gary Webb said. They did it with LSD in the 60s. And one of the reasons that the CIA was all too happy to see hard drugs like LSD become pervasive in the hippie movement is they wanted to discredit the anti-war movement. Mainstream America in the late 60s was still suit and tie. It was still an era where the middle class was sheltered from the horrors that were happening in Saigon and elsewhere to a great extent. And so the CIA, who were very keen on prosecuting the war in Vietnam and the silent wars in Laos and Cambodia, they wanted the anti-war movement to look repugnant to the eyes of mainstream middle-class America. So in other words, they don't want someone like Senator George McGovern or Senator Eugene McCarthy or Senator Robert Kennedy to be the voices and faces of the anti-war movement, because they were well-spoken, they were clean-cut, they held some of the highest offices in American politics. Instead, they wanted hippies, sometimes engaging in free love in the mud, to be the face of the anti-war movement. And so by infiltrating that movement, which they did, and by allowing the proliferation of hard drugs into that movement, they could turn around to mainstream America and say, look, if you think the war in Vietnam is wrong, then you're one of them. And your average person in suburban America didn't want to be associated with that. And of course, there are the other ancillary benefits of, learning what the hippies were up to and discrediting them also by infiltrating them with violent people, when most of the hippies that formed their movements organically weren't violent. They wanted to drink their juices and health foods, and health foods in the 60s tasted really bad. It's only recently that you can now go to Whole Foods and pay $30 for a wheatgrass smoothie. It was very different then. But anyway, that was an added benefit that the CIA had. So yes, the CIA is involved in culture. We know about Charles Manson's involvement with MK Ultra and how he himself was individually used to discredit a lot of the anti-war movement. But to say that the music itself was invented and pushed by the CIA is just wrong. Rap music of all genres, was invented by young kids, mostly black kids. They don't run the CIA, never have, probably never will. Hopefully, would never want to. But that's the point. So I think that Candace, for whatever reason, has just got that wrong because objectively it isn't true. But what is true, like I said, there's always this push and pull between the elites promoting music that is harmful to people, because it is promoted at the expense of conscious music. They profit from it. They own the prisons. They own the stocks in the record companies. They donate to the politicians. They get kickbacks from the politicians in exchange for the donations. And all of it happens in plain sight. Again, this isn't a conspiracy. This is behavioral science. It is psychology. It is groupthink. It is mass formation psychosis, because frankly, a lot of it, while self-serving, it certainly has no conscious element to it. Where that conscience lies is in the music makers themselves. I'm not saying all, but you can find a hell of a lot of more truth in hip hop and any other genre of music than you can in these other places. And so she's just dead wrong about that. And she's also mentioned how, not only did, in her view, the CIA invent gangster rap and other forms of hip hop, but they also invented certain popular genres of rock and roll in the late 60s. That is also false. As I said, the CIA and other federal agencies were very interested in infiltrating the countercultural, hippie, and anti war movement for their own ends. But the music themselves, they don't need to invent and they don't need to promote. That's what the record labels are there for. And one of the biggest conspiracies involves The Doors, and it involves a book that was actually mentioned by Joe Rogan once, and this was called Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon by David McGowan. And it's one of the most poorly researched books about music ever. It draws sweeping conclusions from virtually no real evidence. The premise of the book is that the musicians who lived and congregated in the Laurel Canyon area of the Hollywood Hills in the late 60s and early 70s were all basically not necessarily working for, but under the thumb of the CIA and other intelligence agencies, and that this was part of the wider push, which was real, to discredit the anti war movement that I talked about earlier. But this simply isn't true. And one of the people they point to is Jim Morrison of The Doors, because, his father was in the Navy. Well, a lot of people between the 1940s and the Vietnam draft were in the armed forces. A much higher percentage of the US population was then than are now. So there's nothing particularly unusual about that. In fact, Jim Morrison had a very distant relationship with his father, and one could make the argument that some of his lyrics and some of his poetry was motivated by that childhood neglect. Maybe not, but it's a valid theory. His father is on record saying he didn't think his son was a good singer. Way to motivate your son. I think Jim Morrison was a very good singer. But so that was part of that theory. And the other theory was that these people congregated in Laurel Canyon. But that was always popular with artists because at that time it was secluded and very much, countryside living, but with a 10-minute drive to Sunset Boulevard. This is a matter of convenience, not of conspiracy. And like I said, most things that are labeled conspiracies happen in broad daylight. They are because of ethnic conflicts. They are because of ideological conflicts that are due to upbringing, ethnicity, and class. They're to do with financial interests. They're to do with the same people running government and industry. The private and public sector have increasingly been run by the same people, and they have a revolving door between the two sides. The music industry, unfortunately, at the top isn't any different. But I think it's quite slanderous to say that these artists were somehow inauthentic, because they really weren't. And I would say that either through supporting censorship, as the FBI did of the popular Kingsman song Louie Louie. Let me actually just talk about that for a while, because this just shows you how, as villainous as some of these institutions are, there's also a lot of stupidity. So the song Louie Louie was written long before the Kingsmen had their hit version of it in 63. And prior versions of the song are sung with the lyrics very clearly enunciated. Now, the Kingsman version is famous for the lyrics being very poorly enunciated, and because the recording was done in a very haphazard way, the vocal mic wasn't really recorded pristinely. And so, in spite of the fact that it was a cover song and that the lyrics were widely available to the previous versions, the FBI thought that the Kingsmen were actually producing subversive propaganda, and they spent lots of taxpayer money investigating just what the lyrics were. They tried slowing the recording down, playing it backwards, all this time and money wasted, only to find out that the lyrics were gibberish and could not be understood. So they spent all of that time and money only to be in a place that was less informed than they could have been if they just listened to previous versions of the song and compared it to the Kingsmen's version and realized that while a bit mumbled and poorly recorded, they were the same lyrics, nothing subversive. They were about a man talking to a bartender called Louis about missing his girl because she's across the sea. Simple, innocent, dare we say wholesome. And so there was that. There was the FBI threatening NWA, or a rogue agent in the FBI. There were, some would say that the CIA was behind the death of John Lennon. I think that's a lot more believable than this stuff that Candace Owens is coming out about. And there have been some rather well-researched books on, if not the CIA, then other agencies that were angry at John Lennon's criticism of them, that they maybe went after him. And to make matters even crazier, apparently John Lennon said that if he could have voted for Reagan in 1980, he would have. So strange times. But again, the most outlandish conspiracy theories are sometimes themselves distractions, because you just need to look at who's in charge, what motivates them, and what actions can we tie to these motivations. So no, David Crosby was not working for the CIA. He was just a mean-spirited drug addict that happened to be a very good vocalist. Jim Morrison, like many kids at that time, had a father who traveled around because of his work in the Navy. He wasn't part of the CIA. So Candace Owens and some of the people that influence her are wrong about that too. What is true, though, is that musicians' lives, as I said, they can be made harder. One of my very favorite bands, Blood, Sweat, and Tears, had a hard time because of the government. In that case, it was the State Department. Because David Clayton Thomas, the lead singer of Blood, Sweat, and Tears, and I've told this story before, but it fits in here, so I'll tell it again. He had a criminal record in Canada. He had a very bad relationship with his father, was in a juvenile detention center, cleaned himself up, got into music, never looked back, but the State Department found out about his criminal record. He didn't kill anyone or anything. I think it was like theft and vandalism, which is now legal, weirdly, at least in many areas. And so they wanted to give him a hard time. So they made the band an ultimatum. They said that if you do a tour of the communist bloc in Europe, we'll make sure that any visa problems associated with David Clayton Thomas's criminal record in Canada magically go away. So they did the tour. And then when they came back, the journalists were hitting them from both the left and the right. And it is true that for a long time, the CIA was influencing the editorial position of major media organizations. This was called Operation Mockingbird. Unlike the theory that the CIA invented rap and rock and roll, which is false, this theory isn't a theory because we know, Freedom of Information Act and other disclosures, that it is true. Now, by the 70s, when music was arguably, in some genres, at its most radical, some would say even more than in the 60s, this idea that all 70s music was just the me generation and all about a good time, wonder where that theory came from, because there was a lot of conscious music in the 70s, loads. I would argue on an aggregate level more than in the 60s. In the mid 1970s, the US and the world breathed a sigh of relief because there were commissions that looked into the malfeasance of the intelligence agencies, including the CIA. There was the Church Committee, and I have to give Gerald Ford a lot of credit for allowing this to happen. Many other presidents before and since would not have allowed this information to be so exposed to the public. And while the information that came out in the mid 70s about the intelligence state was incomplete, it was a big revelation. And for a while, the agencies did behave themselves more than they had before, though by no means perfect at all. And obviously, by the time the 90s came, this was memory hold and it was back to the beginning again. Um, I know that we've talked about a lot of things that aren't musical on what is a musical show, but we kind of have to, because when musicians are implicated in being something that they are not, this is not a good thing. And this all began because of the arrest and accusations against Diddy, formerly P. Diddy, before that Puff Daddy. Um, and we don't know if he's innocent or guilty because you're innocent before proven guilty, but it doesn't look good from the things that we've seen. There are videos of him behaving in a, let's just say, a very bad way with a 15-year-old Justin Bieber. Where are the parents? I don't know. There are other really weird things. There are images of him beating a woman in a hotel corridor. Not very good things. And a point I made is that, well, why did he get away with this? Well, Suge Knight didn't get away with his malfeasance that were mainly against other gangbangers, not against women, not against children, as Diddy is alleged to have done weird things to both. And I would say it's because Diddy probably played the game. He didn't walk into the CIA's office and got a brief, but he was doing the bidding of the people who run the record industries, who want to own you by blackmailing you. Industry works this way, whether entertainment or otherwise. Politics works that way too. And so, yeah, there is dirt in the music industry, there is corruption, but the music itself is pure. And no one gets into music. No one practices learning an instrument. No one practices becoming a great lyricist and rapper. No one practices becoming a skilled music engineer because they want to control the world. Music is one of the most pure art forms left. And I don't care if influencers who are out for themselves say otherwise. Leave the musicians alone. And I say this to the people telling lies about them working for the CIA. I say this to the record labels. I say this to governmental and law enforcement agencies who want to censor and crush musicians, especially when they have conscious lyrics. Leave the musicians themselves alone unless they decide to go down dark paths and do bad things, as Diddy allegedly did, but as most musicians don't. Most musicians, I maintain, are better than the average average journalist, and certainly the average politician. But that's what I think. Let me know what you think. As always, it's a young channel, so like and subscribe. Share it around, friends and enemies, and all of that jazz. Take care.